So I thought I'd do something where I'm just kind of just talking about metaphysical idealism. That's kind of the one position that I stake my claim to the most, still with some tentativeness. I want to say I'm not a very confident philosopher, but I mean that in the sense of nothing seems settled for me, and I doubt it ever will. That's probably a good thing. But yeah, metaphysical idealism, I add the word metaphysical on front just because I know that for people who maybe don't spend so much time studying philosophy or metaphysics, idealism tends to conjure up kind of romantic images, this idea of moving towards some ideal goal, kind of head in the clouds, which, to be fair, some metaphysical idealists can tend in that direction. Maybe at my worst moments I do as well. But yeah, so metaphysical idealism is essentially the view that reality is in some way mind dependent. What does that mean? Well, it can mean different things for different idealists, but essentially it means this world around us that I'm looking at, the bookshelf behind me, everything in this world we tend to think of as being out there, as being concrete and completely independent of me. It would be as it is, even if I weren't here, even if nobody were here to perceive it or think of it in any way. Idealism essentially rejects that claim, says there is something about perception or thinkability that kind of imbues itself within the object. So, in some way, I think that bookshelf behind me is not, quote unquote, out there in the world, completely distinct of my mind and distinct of mindedness in general, at least not in the way that we can know or understand it. Because the only way that we can know or understand that bookshelf is in a way that is filtered, essentially, through the lens of experience, understanding, and perception. So that's idealism. And the thing is, I know that for people that aren't idealists, even people that are very philosophically informed, I know that it's strange. I do know that. It comes across as strange. But I don't actually know, that's me conceding too much. I don't think it's strange, but I know that it can seem strange. And I know that because I thought that it was ridiculous for a very long time. I've been into philosophy for probably 15, 16 years. I'm 31 now. And started getting into it when I was a teenager. It's only been the last handful of years, if that it's not seemed strange. And the thing is this is kind of why I'm making this video in the way that I am, a bit more intimately, and just me kind of talking. The reason is, I know that arguments alone for something that is so alien to the way that most people think these days isn't enough. I'm not a believer of I'm not that much of a rationalist that I believe we can just give people good philosophical arguments and then that's going to be it, and that philosophers can change the world with a good argument. I don't think that's true. I don't think that's been the way things have gone historically. If you looked at any big change in thought in history, there's lots of different ways of explaining them. There's material ways, there's political ways, there's lots of different ways of explaining changes in the ways that people think. And so, yeah, I'm going to essentially just give a run through, I think, of my own development towards idealism, just because, given what I just said, I don't think that me presenting just a formal argument or a handful of arguments will be enough. I think those are important, but I think what's more important is seeing how someone can come to believe something. I don't think coming to believe something exists in a vacuum. It has to exist in context, and there were certain points that led me towards finding idealism reasonable. And I mean, now it's pretty much flipped. You know, the idea that materialism could be true, materialism being the idea that what's ultimately real is what is material, or physicalism, the more kind of up-to-date term, I suppose, is, you know, that whatever physics says is true, that is the ultimate reality, and there's nothing further, beyond, or behind, underneath, however you want to put it. There's nothing else to it. That, to me, now seems like the strange position, which is a strange position for me to be in, because that's the kind of thing that most people believe. It's what I used to believe as well. So anyway, yeah, I thought I'd just use this video to kind of give a run through of essentially my development in philosophical thinking towards idealism, in the hope that maybe I can make idealism seem a little more reasonable in some respect, and at least show people what can lead to one coming to believe a position, even just for the fact that I think those things can be interesting in their own right, knowing how someone came to believe something, regardless of what that thing is. So I guess I'll begin with how I entered into philosophical thinking. I suppose I would say that my interest in philosophy, although I didn't consider it philosophy at the time, was when I was a teenager with the onset of new atheism. You know, I was a big Hitchens fan. I loved Hitchens. I liked Dawkins. So I got into all that. I was one of these online debate bros. Cringe thinking about it, but, you know, I was a teenager. It fits the bill. And then I went on to do philosophy, which also fits the bill. But yeah, and I was also a materialist, as you might expect. I didn't think too hard about it. I just thought it was sensible. Anything else is kind of superstition, and that was me as a teenager. And then I studied philosophy at college, and college in UK terms, that is sixth form age, 16, 17, 18. The first thing I think that shook me up a little bit, or I guess that gave me something to think about. Because, you know, a lot of philosophy can just be so, it can sometimes just fail to latch on. And I think that's like 90% of philosophy most of the time, you know. Most of the time it's just, you feel like you're just playing with conceptual understandings that don't really latch on to anything that changes you in any important way. But then occasionally you'll find something that's like, oh, okay, this is like, I understand this, for whatever reason, has shaken me out of a complacency that I didn't even realise I had. Didn't quite get this just yet, but I got a little taste of that with Hume, specifically Hume on causation, which is funny because then I got into Kant years down the line, which makes sense because this is what struck Kant as well, was Hume's taking apart of things like causation. But yeah, it was Hume on causation, and essentially, you know, Hume was an empiricist. So Hume, I'm going to show my complete lack of scholarly rigour here by not knowing when Hume was. Was it 18th century? I need to look this up. Late 18th century? Mid 18th century? David Hume. Oh, I was right. Okay, I can say that. Whew. Yeah, late 18th century. Yeah, he was an empiricist, and which meant that he believed and argued that our knowledge, any knowledge that we can have, is experiential. Any substantive new knowledge about the world must come to us through the senses, as opposed to rationalism, which contends that We can know things merely by thinking about them. You had people trying to prove the existence of God using deductive logic without reference to anything empirical in the world, for instance. But Hume is an empiricist. There's this thing, Hume's fork, which if you imagine a two-pronged fork, you can only have two things. You can either have, I think it was Hume, not Locke, that phrased it, matters of fact or relations of ideas. So you can either have matters of fact, which are things that you get through your senses. I know that this desk is in front of me right here because I can see it, I can feel it, I can touch it. It's known through the senses. It comes to me externally. Or I can essentially shuffle around different ideas that have come to me through the senses, and those are the relations of ideas. Anyway, Hume is an empiricist. Taking the causation example, he noticed that, well, we never experience causation itself. He uses billiard balls as an example. So you have billiard balls on a table, you see one ball hit the other ball. Where's the causation there that you're witnessing? You see one ball cause the other ball. At least that's how you interpret it. But if you look between the balls, you don't spot any physical, any observable thing that you would call causation. And as an empiricist, we have to say, well, what can I do with that? If all knowledge comes through experience, I don't experience causation. It's just something that I kind of have faith in. I have faith that there is this force called causation, and assume it's kind of reify it, make it real in some way through faith, essentially. And that really struck me. That was probably one of the first things that struck me about age 17. And I think it seemed similar to something I'd thought about for a while as a teenager. I still think about today. I've never really delved into it. The thought that I'd had just on my own was, why do we think that probability, or why is it the case that probability is real and manifests in reality? If I flip a coin 1,000 times, why is it the case that it's going to land roughly equally heads and tails? And why is it so miraculous if it doesn't? If it was to land 900 times as heads, we just have to say there was probably either I'd learned how to flip the coin really well, or there'd be something wrong with it. So it kind of struck me as similar to that thought. The thought that essentially along Humean lines that, where is the probability? With each interaction that I perform on the coin, with each flick of my thumb, it's as if there's some invisible law taking hold of it that balances out that coin flip and makes it. And I could never really explain that thought to people. And I've not really tried to learn how to explain it to people. It's not been that big of a deal, but so I probably still can't. A lot of people, I think, would just kind of come back to me with, well, it's obvious, you kind of, if you do it so many times, there's only so many ways that it could land. And there's nothing leaning it in either direction. So over so many amount of times, it's obviously going to land roughly equal. And it's like, yeah, but you're not. Just as Hume with the causation, you're giving me the same kind of explanation that's like, it does this. But why does it do that? Why, where is that force of probability located that we can refer to it, and that it can actually have ironically, I guess, a kind of causative effect on events in the world? So I'd had these kinds of thoughts, and Hume struck a chord with me. So that was in sixth form, about age 17. But idealism still seemed pretty silly to me, even during this. And, I remember at college, we learned a little bit about Berkeley. And Bishop Berkeley, most quoted phrase was esse est percipi, to be is to be perceived. And, essentially we were probably explained it quite well because we had some good philosophy teachers, but what I took from it in my 17-year-old way of understanding things was, idealism it means that there are objects, but they're only there if we look at them. And I knew that it was a bit more complicated than that. Like, I knew that he was saying, well, actually, they don't really even exist out there. they only exist in your head, and so obviously they only exist when you look at them. But that's kind of as basic as it seemed to me, and I think that's what a lot of people think about idealism, and it's difficult to go further than that a lot of the time. But that's how Berkeley was kind of understood by me, and as essentially saying nothing in the world out there is real. It's all in my head, and it only exists when I think and look at it. And then I thought, oh, he has some weird way of explaining how everything's there. It's kind of a Deus Ex Machina, just, kind of get out of jail free card, by saying that, well, everything exists in the mind of God. So, and I was like, okay, yeah, that's just, he's just coming up with something to get around the problem of object permanence, So that was that, and then, but I was still a materialist. That didn't convince me. I thought that was silly, kind of. I thought it was cool, but still hadn't shaken me. And, Hume was a skeptic. Hume was still very much in my new atheist kind of mindset. But yeah, then I went to university. I'd softened up a bit then, I think. I'd become a bit more open to the idea that reality might be... I don't know how to explain it, to be honest. I'd softened up a little bit, that's all I can say. Not very much, I was still a materialist, but... but I was primed for one lecture that I had by my supervisor, by who was to become my PhD supervisor. It was in a series of lectures that was just like introduction to philosophy lectures, where it was just, kind of just hand-picked topics or particular philosophers that were interesting to get people into philosophy and that kind of stuff, or like big problems in philosophy or whatever. And so it wasn't a particularly in-depth thing, but it was a really good like overview, and it was one on Heidegger. I think I've really only had two kind of big aha moments, big realizations in philosophy, and one of them was then. I'm not a Heidegger person. Maybe I will be. It's actually one of the things I want to do at some point for this channel, is try and get into some Heidegger, maybe do some, learn along with me kind of content. But it's been a long time since I looked at Heidegger properly, so I don't want to butcher anything. I believe the lecture was on just the basic Heideggerian distinction between the present at hand and ready to hand. So let me see if I can... I'm sorry if anyone is knows their Heidegger and is listening to this, but because I probably am butchering this, so bear in mind, big pinch of salt, sprinkle that salt all over this, because this is more me than Heidegger probably. But I think the essential idea is, if we take a step back from our usual preconceived notions about what reality is, because that's what we want to do in philosophy, we want to kind of see if... That's one way I think about philosophy actually sometimes, is we want to unburden ourselves of all the presuppositions that we can and see if there's a new way of looking at things. And the way that Heidegger suggests is he suggests that we pay a lot of attention to context, so or that we recognise how much we are always already engaged in a context, and how much we are always already understanding things contextually, as opposed to in isolation. So he thinks that we usually engaging in the world essentially acting towards a goal, or with a project in mind. We're always doing something. If you think about it this way, we're always doing something. I mean, me right now, I'm trying to convey information, trying to do that for a number of reasons. We're always doing something for some purpose, unless we're just completely still and lifeless. Or unless we have what Heidegger called boredom, which is more akin to what we would call depression, I think. But our normal way of engaging with the world is just that, it's engaged with the world. And when we engage with the world like that, when we are engaged, we see objects and we see reality and things in reality as tools, essentially. We see them as ready to hand. This, what's a good example here? This light switch here, I don't know if it's on camera, can't see, turns my light up and down. This is ready to hand right now, because for me, what I'm looking at an up button, a down button, so I could turn the light up or down, or I could turn it off. And that's the context of it. That's, this is what this object is. It's not just this is how I'm interpreting it, or rather, I should say, my reality is always, by default, being interpreted in some way. And the opposite to that, or maybe that's going too far to say the opposite. I haven't brushed up on my Heidegger, as I said, but the other way is present at hand. So if this is to break and it doesn't work anymore, it no longer becomes a tool for me. And that's when I can start to see what it is outside of my context that it was in previously. And if that happens, then I'm liable to see it as a physical object in the world. So, I mean, I've probably butchered that, and I've definitely not given as good of a explanation of it as I got in the lecture. Because what hit me in the lecture was essentially that I'd been assuming that the physical story, the physicalist story, that reality is to be understood most correctly as physical, and as this things are just bundles of atoms and however we want to describe it. I'd been assuming that that was correct by default, or that it was the most correct description of reality. But we only get there from abstracting away from how we experience ourselves in the world and in our contexts all the time. And so essentially I realised, I've been... Actually, I'm not sure if at the time it convinced me. I think it was more just that it opened up the possibility that there could be radically different ways of understanding reality. Because I think the basic idea that Heidegger, or at least that I took from what was being lectured to me about Heidegger, what I took from it was the question, why should I say that the hammer, a tool, when you thought of as a hammer, why should I think that a hammer is less real than the atoms that comprise the hammer, essentially? I think was that I essentially think that was the question that embedded itself in me. But it didn't embed itself in those particular terms. It just embedded itself as a low-level realization, low-level but strong, kind of underlying but strong realization that there can be real reality to things that are not physical, or at least it's up for grabs. And yeah, so that was a big turning point, that Heidegger lecture. The next one that struck me was when I learnt about Kant, Immanuel Kant, and transcendental idealism. This was also at undergrad. And it's funny because I only learnt after, I think, it only clicked after, that Kant had been struck by what had struck me when I was in sixth form. He was struck by the problems that Hume had raised, or the skepticism that Hume had raised. Skepticism about our ability to know some things that we really kind of have to presuppose and have to assume, such as causation. And those are the kinds of things that Kant dealt with. And people talk about Kant's transcendental idealism as kind of a Copernican revolution, in the sense that, Copernicus gave us an articulation of of how the Earth revolves around the sun rather than the sun revolving around the Earth, and that kind of completely made people flip their lid, it flipped people's understanding of things radically. Kant essentially says, the problem is that we've been thinking about our knowledge of the world as something that comes to us externally, and then we just have it, it comes to us, there's this, I've got this fan next to me, my knowledge of this fan comes to me, I know it, and then I can, fiddle with the concepts or whatever that relate to the fan in my head after I've gained that knowledge about it. But instead of this, Kant says, what we can do is can realise that the objects in the world actually conform to our way of knowing them. So it's not that our understanding and our knowledge conforms to whatever comes to us. It's almost there's an active element to our very way of receiving those things that we can't switch off, essentially. And so the Copernican turn was a switch from thinking that our knowledge conforms to objects in the world. We flip that around and think objects in the world conform to our understanding, to our way of knowing. Basic idea doesn't really need that much strict formal argumentation, in my opinion. And I think this is what struck me at the time, was essentially I interpreted the basics of what Kant was saying as this kind of recognition that, oh, okay, yeah, if I do see how I couldn't perceive this desk and this fan, and I couldn't understand them if I wasn't giving them essentially a backdrop to give them form, which would be, space and time. And I also couldn't understand them if I didn't already have some kind of way of categorizing these things that come into my perception. I get a blur of colours in my perception. What is it about the world that could possibly make me or allow me to split that up and to understand things as objects and things as having different kind of meanings, a different kind of context, things as we know them and see them and understand them? How do I even know that things are distinct? How do I even have the notion of distinctness? And so Kant essentially says, well, there must be a lot of this that's coming from us. We give these objects to ourselves in a way that's understandable to us as experiences, as people that experience things. And Kant's trick here was to say that this world that we play an active part in constituting and understanding, it is real. It's not, the problem that I had with Berkeley in college, where I was like, oh, okay, so, we just look around and stuff, it's kind of just in our heads and all that kind of stuff. Kant's like, no, this is real. Like, this is what reality is. We're not meddling with the nature of reality. We're just interpreting it in this way that recognizes our active participation in rendering it understandable. And the idea of these objects distinct from our understanding, that's pretty much unthinkable. And he runs through ways in which we attempt to do that, attempt to try and think the unthinkable, and how it always leads to, well, it's impossible, essentially. Leads to absurdities. And that struck me as correct. What basically struck me as true is this idea that, reality's like a darkened room, and I've got the torch. If I turn the torch off, my perception, if I turn my active constitution of reality through perception and categorization, different ways of understanding things and giving things form for myself, if I turn that torch off, there's nothing there. There's no world for me to experience. Obviously, the analogy isn't great because we know the world is there, but or the room is there. But and to be fair, Kant thinks the room's there as well. It's just, what can we say about it? Nothing. The torch isn't on it. We can't even say that it's a mathematical abstraction, a kind of what we might talk about in physics today, all that kind of quantum fields and stuff like that. That's all experiential as well. That's a experiential way of understanding reality. It's just a very abstracted one. That struck me as essentially as being true, but not. But at the time, not completely fully. It struck me as very cool, and it did strike me as true. I kind of intellectually understood it. But there's a certain way of understanding something where you just feel it, and I didn't quite have it then. And I think what I needed to get to understand it, which I got later, was the distinction between the object of perception, whatever that object is, and perception itself. I couldn't feel a distinct field of perception and understanding that was myself, or that was again, I mean, that's loading things quite a lot, because I'm calling it a self. I don't even want to go that far. I hadn't yet recognized the distinctness of that which is doing the perceiving, if it's one thing, if it's a thing at all, whatever it is, and that which it's bringing into its world, or its remit. And I got that last piece of the puzzle when I was doing my PhD, and that's thanks to my main man, Johann Fichte. Fichte is, I didn't do a thesis on Fichte, but he plays a very central, crucial role in the thesis that I outline, and I'm very glad for that, because I do think I struggled for a long time. Fichte's very difficult to read and to understand. He's definitely the most difficult philosopher I've ever read. I've not attempted Hegel, so I think Hegel will probably be worse. But I mean, Fichte led to Hegel, so I might do all right actually, because they share a lot of the same language and vocabulary. Hegel's kind of springboarding off of Fichte, from what I understand. So yeah, I spent quite a long time learning Fichte. Essentially, I did a course. Shout out to Dr. Mead McLaughlin. Yeah, Dr. Mead McLaughlin. I'm so bad with those kinds of names, I'm sorry. But yeah, I did a course on Fichte, on his foundations of the Wissenschaftslehre, which means the science of knowing. Anyway, Fichte was the guy. Spent many months studying him, and I'm glad I did. And that's because he is who essentially, he was successful in putting the final straw on the camel's back, that was me falling down and accepting the truth and the reality and feeling the full force of idealism. And there were a couple of things that Fichte really helped me to understand and deal with. First is that I can stop thinking of the self and of my perception and my understanding, my being, my horizon of consciousness that brings things forth into my understanding, and I can stop thinking of it as a thing, as this kind of substance. I mean, I knew from Kant that, Kant kind of said it's a kind of transcendental presupposition, this unity of apperception, as he puts it. But for Fichte, he's more simple than that. He just says, no, you got to think of it as activity. It's not a thing, it's an activity, it's an acting. Gives force the idea that that I can really recognize in myself now if I focus on it. This idea that I recognize that even just in virtue of me existing right now and perceiving a world, something other than myself, there's some kind of will, some kind of acting going on. And Fichte really helped me to feel that, I suppose, and that kind of gels with this idea that reality is in some way constituted by my activity that brings reality in to myself and for myself. I don't know where I've got this impression from. I must have got it from somewhere, but I seem to remember that people don't really like Fichte's argument in the Foundations for the self-positing I based on the law of self-identity. I really like it. So it's essentially, the argument is essentially, oh God, can I remember it properly? So the argument is essentially, if we want to take something that we are not going to question, it's probably the law of self-identity. There's nothing more basic than that, arguably, in terms of propositions that we accept. Law of self-identity being A equals A. Can we deny that? I don't think anyone can really deny that. A equals A, B equals B. Things are self-identical. A thing is what it is and is not something else. That's the law of self-identity. And so Fichte starts with that, and he says, well, if we consider that as a proposition, what have we got? We've got A, and we've got an equals. This isn't how he puts it, by the way, but that's how I think about it. We've got an A, we've got an equals. What is the equals? What is it that, a bit like Hume with causation, he's looking at it and he's thinking, what is that? What is that in itself? What is it about that equals? Where is that located? What is it that gives me permission to insert that equal sign there? And he says, well, the only thing we've got at this point can be me, myself. I basically purely and simply affirm that A equals A. The act of positing something as being equal to itself, it must come from me. But then if we say that, we've presupposed a me. We've kind of gone back and said, oh, there's a me that's doing that, that's affirming that, that's giving that, that's saying or affirming that proposition is correct and that something is self-identical. And by the way, a quick aside here, I think one of the reasons people really don't like this is because they think he's just playing word games, proposition games. But he's really not, and this is what I'm saying, this is when stuff started to really click for me. We could think about it concretely. I'm looking at this fan right now, and what he's essentially saying with the A equals A, it's coming from me, is essentially saying, when I look at this fan, I'm saying it is this fan. Or, my way of understanding that fan is as something self-identical. But in me making that judgment, I've got to recognise that it's me making that judgment. And so he's essentially providing another way of thinking about what Kant has already told us, which is that we play an active part in constituting what we're looking at. He's just doing it in this kind of way that's using a logical proposition. So that's why I think people don't like it, so they don't recognise that it has some hold on reality. This Pepsi can, I'm looking at it, this is this Pepsi can, but that's me affirming that, and that's me making that judgment that it is. And he's saying that's built into our logic. So anyway, that's where he starts. A equals A. I'm the one making that judgment, but that's assumed an I. So what is an I? Well, at this point, all we've got is the law of self-identity. So what is the I? Well, we could just say I equals I. That's all we can really say. We don't have any justification for going any further than that right now. We're trying to restrict things to what we can say for definite. What's built into the law of self-identity, what's built into my relation with the fan, what's built in to my relation with this can of Pepsi in front of me. What must we say about it if we're just restricting it to those very basics. Right, it's I, and I'm self-identical to I, so I equals I. So now we've gone from A equals A to I equals I, but then we have another equal sign in the middle. Well, how can I affirm that I equals I? Or rather, what is it, where, the same question, what is it that affirms that self-identity, that gives us that equal sign in the middle? Well, it can only be the I, just the same as it was with A equals A, fan equals fan, Pepsi can equals Pepsi can. The only thing that it can be is the I. And so where does that leave us? Well, that leaves us potentially with an infinite regress, because then, okay, so I've posited the I that posits that I equals I, and then that I that I've just posited, that's also going to be understood as self-identical. So we need another I, or we need to go further back. It's going to end up in a infinite regress. Except that can't make sense. Can't just have an infinite regress of I's. That's kind of reductio. That's an absurd conclusion. So what must be the case? Well, what must be the case, the way Fichte puts it, is the I posits itself purely and simply. With A equals A, we can say that there's an I that is positing that A equals A, and that is asserting that A equals A, that is actively judging that A equals A. When it comes to the I, all that's there to do that judging, that affirming, is the I. And so essentially the way I think about it, he says it affirms itself purely and simply, or posits itself purely and simply. So the way I think of it is, instead of thinking we've got an I equals I, that's created two separate things. But we're not two separate things. Essentially, instead of doing an equals, we do a little arrow that leads back to itself. The reason we can't do that with A equals A, by the way, is because we know that the equals is something that we posit. The A here and the A here. Use my hands as symbols. Right. Yeah, we got an A here and an A here. The equals between them. We know that it's not the A that's positing the A, because we're looking at the fan or the Pepsi can or whatever it is. That Pepsi can doesn't exist for me because it posits itself. That doesn't really make sense. So we know that in the case of A equals A, we're the ones doing the positing. And so it makes sense to have, the two things there with us in the middle. The most important part of the equation, the part that Fichte's trying to draw our attention to, is the equal sign in the middle, essentially. Because what he's drawing our attention to is that equal sign is just an act of affirmation, purely and simply, right? And, we purely and simply posit that the Pepsi can is equal to itself. And so when it comes to us, we posit purely and simply that we are ourselves. And that we exist. And in the case of the I, unlike in the case of A and A, Pepsi can and Pepsi can, fan and fan, unlike those, in the case of the I, we are the affirmation, the equal sign, the affirmation of self-identity is here, it's the I. So there's not this external I coming in and providing that affirmation and providing that judgment that something is self-identical. It is all here. And that's essentially what Fichte's pointing out, is he's saying this is all there is. But there is still the affirmation. So where does that affirmation go? It goes around back onto itself. And that's a good way of thinking about the self-positing I that Fichte thinks is the foundation. Essentially, we can't go any lower than that foundation when it comes to knowledge, because if you think about it, it makes sense. The affirmation I am, essentially, is what that is. And one might, and I do, I think, maybe I'm being too charitable to Descartes, but one might think that is what's meant by the cogito as well. I think, therefore I am. or I think I am, as he puts it elsewhere. It's essentially, it's just the recognition that I am. And contained within that is just this brute self-positing. There's no getting underneath that. Something else doesn't give that to me. I give that to myself. I know that I am. No one else could give that to me. Who or what could give me my own affirmation of myself as existing? And I think that's where my primary recognition of the truth of idealism comes from, because nothing else could give that to me. Not, to be specific, not the physical world. The physical world cannot give me my own affirmation. It doesn't make sense to say that could happen, because that's the foundation for me thinking and experiencing anything, including physicality, including the world that I experience around me, is this basic affirmation of existence. And it's not a conscious, like, I'm constantly thinking I am. It's there. It's always there. It's the precondition and the necessary condition for experiencing anything. That was the real start of my my buying into idealism fully, was thanks to that thought from Fichte. I mean, there's something else that he has made me realise as well, which is that the opposite way of thinking about things, the way that I just said is impossible or doesn't work, this idea that I could come or be explained by something external to me, an ultimate reality of physical stuff, let's say. What Fichte points out is that way of viewing the world, or a way of viewing the world that views me as just a kind of externally caused thing, can be consistent. It can be completely consistent. I mean, Fichte liked Spinoza. He gave Spinoza as this kind of the pinnacle of that way of thinking that he doesn't agree with, but that can be completely consistent. In other words, Fichte says, you can come up with an entire way of understanding reality that is completely logically consistent and explains everything. You can be so airtight with it. But the problem with it is you leave out the I am, the affirmation, which means you leave out the self and consciousness. And people that have these systems, such as physicalism and materialism, if they work them out fully, they'll end up with an intellectually and logically coherent, consistent system, but they'll fail to account for consciousness. By that I mean they won't recognise what consciousness is. They won't recognise that it is so distinct. It's in the realm of A equals A. It's not in the realm of I. Everything is explained in terms of external causes. A causes, B causes C. And in those systems, the physicalist, materialist systems, what Fichte calls dogmatist systems, which is essentially anything that's not Kantian, not critical, those systems will all fail to account for consciousness, and they'll all be thinking of things as A, B, C, external things without any self-affirmation in there. And that means ultimately that the self is considered just another thing. And I think that's true. I do think that's true. I can't see any way of having in principle, any physicalist, materialist system, and to that end, nor can I see any way of having any kind of panpsychist system or anything like that. Anything that fails to recognise the true ground of subjectivity, which is essentially the idea that the world out there is essentially my world and our world. It's a world of experience that presupposes and requires an affirmation of, I don't know if you want to call it self, because that might load it too much, but requires this activity of experience and subjectivity at the base. Fichte did say that those systems can be completely logically consistent, but it misses out consciousness, and it misses out those things which we do tend to believe in, and that we want to believe in as well, such as freedom and morality. Because those things only make sense if we have real consciousness, real subjective will and activity. If we don't, then we're only ever butting our heads against the wall by trying to imbue such things in a world of things. So I think that was that was kind of what got me to idealism, was Fichte in the end. And I still have questions about it. Nothing, like I said, nothing's settled for me. Nothing's completely answered. One thing I have with Fichte is I don't know that he gave a satisfactory account of otherness. I mean, he does provide that account. He provides it theoretically, and he provides it morally with this idea of other people, of other perspectives. But, one thing I struggle with, for instance, is, with panpsychism, they have this thing called the combination problem. How does, panpsychism says that there's a world out there, and every part of that world, all physical stuff, has experience in some way. And so the combination problem for panpsychism is the question, how can different little nodes of experience essentially clump together and form one big experience? Which, that might be a problem for panpsychism, but I struggle still with a similar problem for idealism. I don't know if anyone's articulated this and there's a phrase for it or a term for it, but I struggle with essentially idealism's combination problem, or rather I suppose it's solipsism's combination problem. I accept intellectually the reality of other minds. I also accept them, in reality. I believe that other people are real and all that kind of stuff. So I'm not a solipsist in any real sense, but I struggle. I struggle to know how that starting point of I am and the world exists for me, mediated by, and in some sense constituted by and through my concepts and my ways of giving form to things, the Kantian idea, the Fichtean idea. That way it's always for me. I'm always looking at the world and bringing it in for myself from my perspective. That's my perspective. It's not the perspective of experience in general. And so I still struggle to figure out my own, or idealism's own, combination problem. How does my experience combine with other people's experience to form a whole? How can they coexist even? Because if things, if the whole point is that beyond experience and beyond my experience is unthinkable, well, the idea of another person's perspective is beyond my horizon. It's beyond my horizon of experience. So why is that not unthinkable as well? And you can say, well, it's it's because it's of the same kind as what you experience. And I've had idealists say this to me. They'll say, well, it's easy. You just, you know what your experience is like. You just assume that there are other perspectives out there like yours. It's like, well, that's the problem. How can that be the case if, essentially, how is that not assuming some noumena, in the Kantian sense, something beyond experience? I guess they'd say, well, it's not assuming anything beyond experience. That Kant's experience wasn't meant to be personal. Maybe it's a particularly or specifically Fichtean problem with that affirmation of I am, the self-positing I. Maybe I'm too wrapped up in that. I don't know. But that's the problem that I get left with. But these are problems within the context of me accepting idealism, accepting that reality is mind dependent thoroughly. I suppose one other thing is it's getting on quite a bit. I've spoken for quite a long time, so I'll just mention it briefly. There was a paper by Tom Stoneham who talks about Berkeley's idealism, and it really helped to clarify or make explicit something about idealism that might help people to see that it's not this silly position that some might think it is. And probably simplifying this load, it's been a while since I read Stoneham's paper, but I think the basic idea is essentially, the normal way of viewing the world that people tend to think about the world is they think, we've got a person here, we've got an object here, and the person perceives the object, and that object exists within their mind somehow. They have an idea of the object, they have their perception of the object, or their idea or their perception of the object. So you've got three things really. You've got the person, you've got the idea, and then you've got the object. That's the normal way of viewing things. And that idea, that floating around us above the person, that's consciousness that we have the hard problem of consciousness with. How do we account for that in, if the object out here, if this is the realm of the world, where is that located? What is that? And now when people think about idealism, what people often think is, so you got the person, you got the object or the world, and then you got the idea floating above the person. And people often think that idealism gets rid of the object and says, those aren't real, just stick with the ideas here. And that's why people think it means that you're saying reality is illusory. But Stoneham points out that even for Berkeley, who people think is the kind of archetypal, kind of crazy, let's get rid of the world, say it's not real idealist, even for him, it's actually not that way around. It's, you've got the person, and the normal way of viewing things, you got the little image in his head, and you've got the object, you got the world. And Stoneham says essentially what Berkeley does and what idealism does, or at least good idealism maybe, I don't know, that'd be my contribution, is it gets rid of that. It gets rid of that above there. And so all you've got is this and this. And you might say, well, isn't that physicalism? It's like, no. I mean, perhaps it could be not naive realist physicalism in some sense. It's a different argument, right? The point is that idealism does this. You got the self, and then you got the world. The only difference here is we've eliminated the middleman, that airy-fairy kind of, what's going on there bit, and we've said what we've got here, all that we need to do is construe it or understand this as experiential, as experience, as idea. So I look at this Pepsi can, it's not that I think, okay, there's me, and then there's this Pepsi can, which is a physical thing, but there's also, when I'm looking at it, I can't get to that physical thing. So I'm just kind of imagining this physical thing in some sense. And actually that means there is no, because I can't get beyond that, then I've got to say that it's imaginary. It's like, no, I'll just say there's two things. There's me and there's this Pepsi can. It's just that I'm construing this Pepsi can as experienced, which it is. I'm experiencing it. And if you look at it, you'll be experiencing it too. If we describe it in mathematical properties, we'll be experiencing those mathematical properties manifest on a page in equations, or in our heads as ideas about what might underlie it in some sense, or how it might behave if it were melted down into its constituent parts or something. It's all experiential, but it's all the same as we experience. We've not posited some invisible realm of perception. It's just that is what things are. It doesn't change them, doesn't make them less real. They're still there. If I turn away, that Pepsi can's still there, because all that it means for it to still be there is I'll perceive it when I look back at it. It's not that it disappears, it's just that there is no other frame of reference to work from. So yeah, I thought I'd end on that, just a bit of Stoneham, because I definitely recommend checking out the paper. I'll leave a link to it in the description. As you can tell, I'm a bit worn out. This has gone on for much longer than I thought, but idealism's fun. I can't. When I got into the Fichte stuff, I couldn't help myself. Had to get invested in it. It's much more exciting than materialism. Like, come on. It's just, yeah, materialism's boring. It's also not true. Be an idealist.